9 professional killers had sealed every exit. 3 former Navy SEALs studied the same map, the same building, the same frozen grid of streets, and they used one word: impossible. She looked at the same map, same building, same streets, and she counted 4 gaps nobody else could see. This is the story of how she used every single one of them. The elk went down at 411 yards. One shot, no adjustment. The wind off the Beartooth Range had been shifting. All morning, reading wrong on the cheek, pulling left in 3-second gusts. That would have sent most hunters back to the truck. She had waited, not because she was patient by nature, because her father had taught her that. Patience is not a personality trait. It is a decision you make every 30 seconds until the moment you stop making it. She made that decision for 47 minutes on her stomach in the frozen grass before she squeezed the trigger. The elk dropped without a sound. Her name was Lena Harwick, 26 years old, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 127 pounds when she remembered to eat breakfast, which was not every morning. She had been living outside Red Lodge, Montana for 14 months, in a one-room cabin she had found through a retired forest service ranger who owed a favor to a man she had never met. The rent was $300 a month. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles east. The nearest town was 11 miles south. She liked all 3 of those numbers. She worked as a backcountry hunting guide from August through November. The rest of the year she split wood, maintained the cabin, and did not speak to very many people. 2 ranchers down the valley had offered help with the elk, packing 3 separate times across 2 seasons. She had declined all 3. Not out of stubbornness, though it looked like stubbornness from the outside. Out of precision. There were things she could do alone. She preferred to know exactly which things those were. The pack-out took 2 hours and 40 minutes in temperatures that had dropped to 19 degrees before noon. Her left shoulder began complaining at the 90-minute mark, the way it always did under load. A torn rotator cuff. Helmand Province, September 2020, repaired in the field and never properly rehabilitated because she had not told the battalion surgeon how bad it was. She had been afraid he would pull her from rotation. He would have. The shoulder had been her private accounting ever since, a debt she paid on a sliding scale depending on what the day required. She paid it now, kept walking. The cabin was dark when she got back. She did not turn on the lights. Immediately, old habit, her father's habit, absorbed so completely over so many years that she no longer recognized it as something she had learned. She stood inside the door for a full 30 seconds, letting her eyes adjust, before she set down the pack and crossed to the wood stove. One wall of the cabin held a single photograph: Dennis Harwick in dress blues, Master Sergeant chevrons sharp enough to cut glass, standing in front of a vehicle she did not recognize at a location that had never been disclosed to her. He was not smiling in the photograph. He rarely smiled in photographs. He believed that photographs recorded something real, and that a man who smiled at a camera was lying about what the moment actually cost him. She had disagreed with him about that for most of her adolescence. She had stopped disagreeing somewhere around age 20. On the back of the photograph, in his handwriting, in permanent marker that had bled slightly into the paper over the years, aim at the truth, not the target. She had always assumed he meant shooting. Under the floorboard beside the south wall, wrapped in oilcloth and then in canvas and then in a second layer of oilcloth, was an M40A6, her rifle, the primary sniper weapon of the United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper Battalion. .308 Winchester Magnum, 24-inch Schneider barrel. Macmillan A6 stock, Nightforce ATACR scope, dialed to her specific eye relief. And 0. Effective engagement range of 800 meters in trained hands. She had qualified to 840 yards at Camp Pendleton in 2019. Second highest score in her battalion that year. She had not touched it since the day she drove away from the discharge processing center at 29 Palms. That was 14 months ago. She did not touch it now. She cooked rice and canned black beans on the wood stove, ate standing at the counter looking out the small window above the sink, and went to bed at 9:43. The wind picked up around midnight and pushed snow against the north-facing glass in a sound like static, like something trying to speak, without quite enough language to do it. She slept through it. She always slept through it. The truck pulled up at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning. She was awake before the headlights hit the window. She was at the door before the engine stopped, not because she was afraid, because she had been trained for 14 years to understand that the middle of the night meant something, and that the correct response to meaning was attention. The man who got out of the truck was 61 years old, though he moved like a man who had spent decades arguing with gravity and not entirely won. Orson Greer, former Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, her father's closest friend across 2 deployments, 3 duty stations, and the kind of sustained silence that only exists between men who have watched each other decide things they can never describe at a dinner table. He had not called ahead. He had not spoken to Lena in 4 years. The last time she had seen him was at her father's funeral, in the rain in a cemetery outside Bozeman, where Orson had stood at the back and left before the reception, and she had not had the energy to follow him. Dennis Harwick had died of a heart attack in March of 2019. He was 53 years old and in good physical condition for a man his age. The death certificate said cardiac arrest. The autopsy was routine. Nothing was flagged. Nobody questioned anything, because men who had lived the way Dennis Harwick lived sometimes died the way Dennis Harwick died, and the world was tired and had other things to flag. Lena had accepted this. She had accepted it the way you accept a thing you have no instrument to measure. She put it away. Orson stood outside the truck in the snow without speaking for a moment. Then he reached back through the driver's window and brought out a small object. A waterproof Pelican case, roughly the size of a paperback novel. He walked to the door and held it out. She took it. Inside the case, nested in foam, a micro SD card sealed in a lead foil pouch. And beneath the card, folded twice, a piece of paper, her father's handwriting. She recognized it before she finished unfolding it. The date at the top was 6 months before his death. If Orson brings this to you, they found me. Open it alone. She looked at Orson. The snow was catching in his gray hair and not melting. He said, I kept it 5 years, waiting for the right time, waiting to know what the right time felt like. He stopped, looked at the tree line instead of her face. Last week somebody broke into my house in Billings, didn't take the television, didn't take the cash I keep in the kitchen drawer. They went through the back bedroom. That's where I had the case stored, inside an old boot inside a locked footlocker. He stopped again. They didn't find it. I keep a decoy. She waited. He said, I drove straight here, 12 hours, didn't stop except for gas. Outside Missoula, checked my mirrors every 10 minutes the whole way. He looked at her for the first time since he arrived. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had decided tonight was the night he was going to set it down, whether the ground was ready for it or not. She asked him to come inside. He shook his head. He said he needed to keep moving. He said he was sorry it took this long. He said some other things that she heard but could not have repeated immediately because her mind was already somewhere else, moving in the way it moved when the variables were shifting too fast for language. He got back in the truck. She watched his taillights until the road bent and took them. Then she went inside, sat at the table, and did not open the case for 11 minutes. She sat with the weight of it in her hands and the silence of the cabin around her and the snow moving across the windows. Then she turned off the lamp. Total darkness, old habit, her father's voice from somewhere in the filing system of her memory. The ground tells you where the enemy is before your eyes. Do feel the slope. Cold air falls, warm air rises. Move with the cold. She sat in the dark for 40 seconds. Then she opened the case. The micro SD card fit a reader she kept in her laptop. The laptop took 40 seconds to boot. She sat in the dark with the screen as the only light, and then there was a file named with a date, and then she opened it, and then the room filled with her father's voice. He said her name first, not her full name. He said Hatchling, the name he had used for her from the time she was 6 years old, because she had been born small and loud and had not stopped being either one. The last time she had heard him say that word was Christmas of 2018. She had not realized until this moment that she had been counting the months since the last time. She did not cry. Her eyes went hot for approximately 4 seconds and then went cold again. The rest of her stayed still. The darkness of the cabin wrapped around the sound of his voice like something protective, like the dark had been waiting for exactly this and had held itself ready. She thought, he knew I would turn off the light first. He knew I would sit in the dark before I opened anything. He built this for exactly the person he knew I would still be. What her father said, in the audio file recorded in what she recognized as the back bedroom of his house in Bozeman, 6 months before he was found dead in the front hallway from cardiac arrest, was this. In October of 2007, in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, he was serving as the senior JTAC, attached to a Delta Force element operating out of a forward fire base near the Arghandab River. His job was to control close air support and serve as the communications link between the element and higher command. He had done that job in 2 prior deployments without incident. He believed in it. On the 14th of October, the element commander, a colonel named Vance Prudhoe, ordered a direct action strike on a compound 3 kilometers north of the firebase. The intelligence package said the compound was an IED assembly site, Tier 2 priority, 6 to 8 military-age males, weapons cache active, construction of at least 2 devices. Dennis was the one who called in the strike. What the compound actually was, a family home, 2 adult men, 1 elderly, 1 40 years old, 4 women, 7 children ranging in age from 3 to 14. The youngest 3 were asleep when the first round hit. 13 people. The intelligence had been fabricated. Dennis did not know this at the time. He knew it 48 hours later, when a surviving adult daughter reached the firebase with a local interpreter and a collection of photographs, and when the photographs were cross-referenced against imagery that should have been reviewed before the strike was ever called, the compound had never held weapons. The compound had never been flagged at any prior surveillance level. The intelligence package had been constructed and inserted into the targeting system by someone above the element level, using access that required a minimum of GS-15 clearance, or its military equivalent. Dennis filed an internal report through the Inspector General channel, the formal process the right way. The report disappeared within 72 hours. He received a verbal communication from a staff officer he had never met, telling him that his report had been reviewed and determined to contain classified methodological information that could not be preserved in the standard IG record system. He was reassigned within the week. It took him 4 more years to understand the full shape of it. The 13 civilians at that compound had been killed for one reason. The 40-year-old man had witnessed a logistics transaction 3 weeks prior at a border crossing, a transaction involving weapons, not American weapons from the official supply chain. American weapons, serial numbers removed, moving through a private logistics channel under a contract vehicle operated by a company called Meridian Group. The value of the contract across 4 fiscal years was $3.1 billion. The primary political beneficiary of the Meridian Group's government contracts was a United States senator from Virginia named Boyd Ashford. The 40-year-old man who died in that compound had decided to talk to a journalist. After that, Dennis had spent 11 years collecting and verifying, not quickly, carefully, the way a scout sniper collects range data, one confirmed piece at a time, checked against a second source before he trusted it. There was one person still alive who held the second half of what he had built. A woman named Sylvie Drummond, 38 years old, Defense Intelligence Agency analyst stationed in Portland, Oregon. Her father had been the interpreter at that firebase in 2007. He was the one who brought the surviving daughter and the photographs to Dennis. He died in 2011 in a car accident that Dennis had never believed was an accident. Sylvie Drummond had spent 11 years building her own case from inside the DIA. Dennis said, "Find her before they do. You have 22 hours from the moment Orson delivers this to you. After that, the window closes, and it does not reopen." He said, "I am sorry I taught you to carry things alone." He said, "Aim at the truth, not the target." Then the file ended. Lena sat in the dark with the screen going dim beside her and the snow pressing against the windows and the photograph of her father on the wall behind her, where she could not see it but could feel its exact location in the room. She had 45 seconds of stillness. Then she picked up her phone. The number was in her father's file, a name attached to it, Garrett Swick. Former 75th Ranger Regiment SIGINT Specialist, discharged 2022, now doing private cybersecurity work out of Billings. Dennis's note beside the number said simply, "He knows you might call, tell him it's time." It rang twice. A voice answered, young, alert in the way of someone who has trained themselves To wake up clean because their job once required it. Yeah. She said, my name is Lena Harwick. Dennis Harwick was my father. A pause, not long, 3 seconds, then, I've been waiting 2 years for this. Call, where are you? Red Lodge. I'm in Billings, hour and 20, don't leave without me. I don't know you. No, but your father did, and he told me things about you that I'm not going to say over the phone, so either you trust that your father knew what he was doing when he built this, or you go alone and you don't make it past the first building. A short pause. I'm not saying that to be dramatic, I'm saying it because it's operationally true. She said nothing for a moment. Then, you've got 90 minutes. I'll be there in 80. She put the phone down. She crossed to the south wall and lifted the floorboard. The oilcloth came away smoothly, the way she had rolled it 14 months ago. And the rifle was exactly as she had left it. She checked the action by feel. In the low light, ran her thumb along the barrel, confirmed the scope caps were sealed. The stock was cold from the floor. She put it on the table. She did not chamber around. She was not leaving for another 79 minutes. She made coffee. She sat at the table. She did not look at the rifle. She did not look at the photograph. She thought about what 22 hours actually meant. She thought about a 40-year-old man she had never met, who had seen something he should not have seen, and who had decided to say something about it, and who had died in a compound with his family because of that decision. She thought about what it would have cost him to make that choice, to look at what he saw at that border crossing, and decide that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. She thought about her father in a back bedroom in Bozeman, recording his voice onto a micro SD card and sealing it in lead foil and giving it to the man he trusted most in the world, and asking that man to carry it for 5 years until the moment was right. She thought he aimed at the truth. And she thought, I don't yet know what that means. Garrett Swick arrived in 73 minutes in a gray Dodge cargo van with Wyoming plates and a dent in the rear quarter panel, and what appeared to be 3 separate laptop rigs visible through the driver's window before he had even killed the engine. He was 28 years old and looked at 6 feet. Even lean, a beard that suggested he had stopped shaving around the time he left the army and had not found a compelling reason to resume. He moved with the efficient looseness of someone who had been trained to cover ground quickly and had kept that training current. He got out and looked at her and said, "Your shoulder." She said, "What about it?" "Your father told me. Helmand, 2020. He said you never had it properly repaired." He said it neutrally, not sympathetically, the way you note a variable that affects the plan. She said, "It functions." He said, "I know, that's different from healed." He went to the back of the van. "I've got topographic overlays, satellite imagery, and full building plans for every structure in the Pearl District of Portland, pulled from the city permit database. I need about 20 minutes to build the operational picture. Once you tell me the exact address." She told him the address. He nodded and climbed into the back of the van and began working. She finished her coffee standing in the doorway of the cabin. She looked at the photograph one last time. She put it in her jacket pocket. She locked the cabin. She rolled the M40A6 into its canvas sleeve and put it in the van. She got in the passenger seat. She said, "My father trusted you." He said from the back. He trusted me enough to tell me this day was coming. He did not tell me everything. He said you'd have the rest. Why a ranger? A pause in the keyboard sound. I flagged an anomaly in a signals intercept in 2021, a routing pattern on encrypted comms that shouldn't have existed. I reported it up my chain and was told I had misread the data. 6 weeks later, I was separated on a performance review that had no prior indication it was coming. Your father reached out 4 months after that. He said he'd been watching the same pattern for 3 years and that I had almost tripped a wire that got people killed before I did. He said he'd been watching me since I flagged it, making sure I was safe. A pause. I didn't know men like that still existed. She said nothing. He said, I'm sorry about him. She said, I know. They drove south and then west. The snow thinned as the elevation dropped in, then stopped entirely around the Idaho border, leaving the highway clean and black and straight. Garrett drove. She sat with the operational picture forming in her head, the way it had always formed in layers, the way her father had taught her to build a range card. Start with what you know for certain, layer in what you can infer, mark everything else as unknown and give each unknown a question that, when answered, will resolve the layer above it. What she knew for certain, Sylvie Drummond was in a building in Portland's Pearl District. Garrett had a Portland address that had been embedded in the audio files metadata, placed there deliberately by her father. There were people who wanted to reach Sylvie Drummond before Lena did, or at minimum, wanted to prevent Sylvie from leaving with whatever she carried. What she could infer, the break-in at Orson's house in Billings was not random. Someone had been tracking the SD card, or tracking Orson, or both. The timing, 5 years after her father's death and happening now, in the week Orson finally moved, was not coincidence. It was pressure. Something had changed. Either the people who killed her father had a reason to act now, or Sylvie Drummond had moved in a way that forced their hand. What she did not yet know, how many people were in that building, how they were positioned, what their objective was, and whether Sylvie Drummond knew she was being watched. At 2 hours and 40 minutes outside Portland, Garrett climbed through to the front and set a laptop on the dash mount he had rigged between the seats. The satellite imagery was current to within 6 hours. The building was a 12-story mixed-use residential in the Pearl District, built in 2004. Full-floor residential units on floors 4 through 12, commercial on 1 and 2, parking structure adjacent. He had pulled the full architectural drawings from the Portland Bureau of Development Services permit archive. He began walking her through the external approach vectors. Then he stopped. She watched him stop, the way a person stops when a calculation comes back wrong, not dramatically, just the small physical stillness that happens when the brain is saying, wait. He said, look at this. He zoomed the thermal overlay, stitched from imagery he had pulled from a commercial satellite past 6 hours prior, 9 heat signatures in and around the building, 2 at street level, 2 on the roof structure, 3 distributed across upper floors, interior near windows, 2 in the parking structure. She looked at the angles. She looked at where each signature's field of coverage would fall based on standard overwatch positioning, based on what she knew about how trained shooters set up a perimeter. The coverage was not outward facing. She said, they're not keeping people out. He said, no. They're keeping her in. Every angle converges inward. If someone approaches from outside, half of them don't even see it. But if she moves toward any exit, she walks into a crossfire from at least 3 positions regardless of which way she goes. He looked at the screen. This is a containment structure, not a protection structure. She looked at the building for a long moment. Sylvie Drummond was not being guarded. She was being held in place, invisible to herself, by 9 people who were waiting for her to move. The moment she tried to leave, or the moment someone external made contact, or the moment something changed in the calculus above them, at the senator's level or the colonel's level, the 9 people would receive an order. And then Sylvie Drummond would become a statistic, an analyst who died in a fire or fell from a balcony or suffered a medical event in the night. The kind of death that closes a file without opening one. She thought, my father built a plan that ends with me standing in front of this building. She thought he would not have built this plan if he did not believe it could work. She said, pull the building's historical infrastructure records, not the digital permit database, the original city engineer surveys, pre-2000. He looked at her. She said, Portland has a buried stormwater culvert system under the Pearl District. Some of it dates to the 1890s. It's not on any current utility map. But if this building was constructed on fill that went over pre-existing drainage infrastructure, there may be access points that aren't in any security schematic. The keyboard sound resumed, fast and purposeful. She looked at the building on the screen. 9 positions, each one placed by someone who had thought carefully about every conventional approach, every door, every window, every line of sight from the street. But the person who had designed this perimeter had designed it looking outward from the building's footprint, had designed it for the world as it existed on current maps, in current permit databases, in current security assessments. Her father's voice from somewhere in her memory, the enemy knows the map, he does not know the territory. She thought about 4 gaps. She was still thinking about them when Garrett said, Lena. She looked over. He had the Oregon State Archives database open on his secondary screen. A scanned engineering survey from 1967, referencing earlier construction work. He zoomed to a notation in the bottom left corner of page 7 of a municipal drainage assessment for the Pearl District Development Zone. The notation referenced a brick-lined culvert, constructed 1894, running beneath what was now the eastern half of the Pearl District, still structurally intact as of the survey date, accessible via 4 maintenance shafts. The maintenance shafts were not recorded in any permit filed after 1971. They were not in the city's current utility GES system. They existed only in this survey, and in the actual ground beneath their feet, and in the gap between what the 9 people in that building believed was possible and what actually was. She looked at the survey location. She looked at the building footprint. Shaft 3 was 12 feet from the sub-basement foundation wall. Position 3's thermal signature was 1 floor above the sub-basement level, at the north stairwell. Based on the building's structural drawings, the north stairwell did not have a sight line to the sub-basement utility corridor. Position 3's coverage angle was calibrated for the lobby entrance, not for someone coming up from below. That was the first gap. She had not yet found the other three. She would find them once she was inside. That was how her father had always taught it. You identify one confirmed entry. You build the rest from what you learn on the ground. You do not plan beyond what the situation will tell you. She looked at the building one more time. She thought about a man she had been told was dead, whose staged death she had witnessed from 300 meters in the worst month of her life. She had seen something in the thermal imagery that she had not said aloud. One of the 9 signatures had a movement pattern when it shifted position across the upper floors, a slight drag on the left side, barely detectable. She knew that pattern. She had spent 2 years watching it move ahead of her through terrain that was trying to kill them both. She needed to be wrong about that. She knew she was not wrong. She pulled on her jacket. She checked the M40A6 in its canvas sleeve in the back of the van. She checked the action. She checked the scope. She confirmed. The 0 had not shifted in transport. She chambered 1 round. She applied the safety. She put the canvas sleeve over her shoulder. The left shoulder took the weight, and she let it. Garrett turned off the overhead light in the van. In the dark, quietly, he said 4 gaps. She said 4 gaps. He said, "You can't do this with a bad shoulder." She said, "I can do this because I know it hurts and I know exactly how much." That's different from not being able to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father said you would say something like that." She said, "What did he say after that?" He said he raised you right." She looked at the building through the windshield. 12 stories, dark windows. 9 people inside who did not know she had found the first gap. Who did not know that Dennis Harwick's daughter was sitting 2 blocks away in a gray van, looking at the space they had forgotten to seal. She thought about the inscription on the back of the photograph in her pocket. She had always assumed he meant shooting. She reached for the door handle. 4 gaps, she said. Let's see if he taught me enough. The maintenance shaft was exactly where the 1967 survey said it would be. Lena found it behind a chain-link fence at the far east end of a service alley that smelled of motor oil and standing rainwater. The padlock on the fence was a commercial master lock, 20 years old, the kind that opens with a bolt cutter or a properly applied wrench and enough leverage. She used the wrench 12 seconds, she had counted. Garrett's voice came through the single earbud she wore in her right ear, low and clean. Thermal shows position 3 stationary. He hasn't moved in 11 minutes. You've got a window. She didn't answer. Answering used air she needed for something else. The shaft cover was cast iron, 1890s manufacture, set flush with the alley floor under 30 years of accumulated grime that had hardened into something close to mortar. She worked the pry bar into the seam, felt the resistance. Applied weight through her legs instead of her arms. The cover shifted, moved, then lifted. Cold air rose out of the darkness below. Not stale the way basement air goes. Stale, moving cold. The culvert was still draining. She lowered herself in. The brick lining was exactly as the survey described, 4.5 feet of clearance, which meant she moved at a crouch, her left shoulder pressed close to the curved wall to keep from scraping the rifle sleeve across the brickwork. The water on the floor was 2 inches deep and 41 degrees, which she knew because she had planned for it and had waterproofed her boots at a hardware store off I-5 40 minutes prior. Planning for the things you can control is not optimism, it is arithmetic. She counted steps, her father's method, in a situation where you cannot see. Your position on a map, you count what you can count, steps, seconds, breaths. You build your location out of small certain numbers instead of guessing at large uncertain ones. At 212 steps, the culvert made a 90-degree turn north. At 340 steps, she felt the air change, warmer and above her faintly, a vibration in the brickwork that meant structural foundation. She was under the building. She found the maintenance shaft access on the interior side by feel, both hands running the wall until her fingers caught the edge of a recessed iron ladder rung. She went up slowly, testing each rung before committing weight. The rungs held, old iron, better than what they made now. At the top, a utility access panel in the sub-basement floor. She pressed her ear against it first, listened for 30 seconds, nothing. She came up into darkness. The sub-basement smelled of old concrete and electrical conduit and the faint chemical trace of an HVAC system that needed servicing, emergency lighting in. The far corner threw a dim red glow over concrete block walls and a run of exposed utility piping. She took 30 seconds to let her eyes complete their adjustment. Then she oriented herself against the building plan she had spent 40 minutes memorizing in the van. The north stairwell was 12 meters northeast. Position 3 was one floor above at the lobby level, covering the main entrance from an interior angle that the person who designed this layout had considered airtight. They had forgotten to think about what was underneath them. She crossed the sub-basement without using a light. 14 steps, she found the stairwell door cracked. It listened. A man's breathing, controlled and slow, the specific rhythm of someone trained to manage their heart rate under sustained attention. She recognized the pattern. It was the same counting rhythm her own instructors had hammered into her at Scout Sniper School. 3 counts in, hold 2, 4 counts out, repeat until your hands stop shaking. She eased through the door. He was at the base of the stairwell, one step up from the lobby level, back to the wall, watching the main entrance through a gap in the interior glass partition. His rifle was a bolt-action, suppressed, bipod deployed on the window ledge. He had a clear line to the front door and both elevator banks. He had no line to the stairwell door behind him. That was the first gap. She came across the 4 meters between them in 6 steps. He heard her at step 5. He was turning when she reached him. She caught his right arm before it got to the rifle, pulled it back and down the way she had been shown how to do it 300 times on mats in Quantico, until it was no longer a technique and was just a thing her body did when the angle was right. He went down. She controlled the descent. He did not hit the floor hard enough to make a sound that carried. She had his zip ties off his vest in 4 seconds, used 2 on his wrists, 1 around the base railing. She put 2 fingers of tape across his mouth from the roll in her jacket pocket. She took his radio and clipped it to her left lapel. She leaned down close to his ear and said quietly, "Dennis Harwick sends his regards." Then she took his notepad from his vest pocket and wrote those 5 words on the top sheet and tucked the notepad back into his vest where anyone who checked on him would find it. She went up the stairs. Garrett's voice, 2 is still stationary on the parking level, 4 and 5 haven't moved, you're clear to 3. She was already past 3. But she noted something as she climbed, something that her father had taught her to file and not discard, one of the thermal signatures she had been tracking. On the upper floors was no longer moving in the pattern it had held for the past 2 hours. Position 9 upper floor had been consistent in its Overwatch sweep since Garrett began monitoring, consistent in every way except that slight leftward drag on each lateral shift. She had noted it in the van and said nothing. Now, on the thermal feed Garrett was pushing to her earbud every 90 seconds. Position 9 had gone dark on the roof level. Not repositioned, gone from the building's thermal envelope entirely. She said nothing to Garrett yet. She filed it, she kept climbing. The building's configuration rewarded people who had memorized it the night before. She had memorized it the night before. She knew which stairwell doors had hydraulic closers loud enough to matter. She knew which floor held the building's main electrical junction for emergency lighting. She knew which access corridors connected to which utility risers. She had built this knowledge the way her father had taught her to build all knowledge, not as a list to remember but as a picture to inhabit. You don't memorize a building, you learn to live in it before you arrive. She had been living in this building in her mind for 6 hours. She reached floor 7 without contact with positions 2, 4, or 5. Position 3 was neutralized and on the sub-basement floor. Position 6 through 9 she had not yet fully confirmed. Then Garrett said, "Lena, stop." She stopped. Position 3's thermal is gone, not gone as in he left his spot, gone as in the signature dropped to near ambient. He's on the floor. A pause. Somebody just queried his radio on their command channel. No response. They're going to notice. She did the math. A non-responsive radio check in a 9-person containment operation did not generate a 30-minute grace period. It generated 2 minutes of waiting and then a response. She said barely above a breath, "How long?" 1 minute 40 best case. They'll send position 2 to check. She was at the floor 7 corridor. The apartment she needed was 712, the northwest corner unit. Sylvie Drummond had been in that unit for 72 hours based on the access card log data Garrett had pulled from the building's management system. Using a utility credential vulnerability he had identified in the parking structure's network. She moved down the corridor. At Unit 712, she knocked twice, paused, knocked once. Her father's file had included this detail, a signal Dennis had established with Sylvie Drummond through a channel Lena did not yet fully understand. The door opened in 4 seconds. The woman who opened it was 38 years old and looked like someone who had been awake for most of the past 72 hours and had made peace with that fact. Medium height, dark eyes that evaluated Lena in a single pass, with the focused attention of a person who spent their professional life assessing information for what it was actually saying rather than what it appeared to say. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark colors. She had a phone in her left hand and a thumb drive in her right. She said, "You're Harwick's daughter." Lena said, "We have under 90 seconds." Sylvie Drummond opened the door fully and stepped back. "I know." What happened in the next 40 seconds changed the shape of everything Lena had believed about what she was walking into. Sylvie Drummond was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She was a woman who had been waiting for a specific kind of help to arrive, so she could complete a specific kind of operation she had been building for 11 years. She said this clearly and quickly, the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed, because they knew they would need to say it fast. She was not simply a DIA analyst. She had been running a parallel evidence collection operation embedded within the agency since 2013, using her access and her clearance and her institutional knowledge of how intelligence files moved through the system to build a case against Meridian Group and the people. Above it, she had been doing this alone, carefully, with the patience of someone who understands that a case built too fast and filed too soon gets buried, and that the only way to build something that cannot be buried is to make it so complete and so cross-verified that burying it would require burying the entire system around it. The second half of Lena Harwick's evidence was not a file she carried on a drive. It was her testimony, corroborated by 3 chain-of-custody documents she had committed to memory after destroying the physical copies, documents that established the financial routing from the Defense Department's procurement office through 2 shell entities to Meridian Group's operating accounts. She could reconstruct those documents verbatim. She had practiced, and 48 hours ago she had emailed a 4th document to a dead drop server using an address she had not accessed in 3 years, locked behind a voice print authentication she possessed, and a physical cryptographic token she had been carrying on her person for 7 years. The token was a key fob no larger than a thumbnail worn on a cord around her neck under her shirt. They could not kill her and get what they needed, not cleanly. They needed the voice print. They needed the token. They needed her to activate the dead drop voluntarily or under conditions they could control. That was why she was still alive. That was why the 9-person perimeter existed, not to keep the world out, but to keep her contained, to manage the timing, to wait for an order from above. That said, the moment to take the token had arrived. She said all of this in 40 seconds. Then she said, "Your father and I have been coordinating this for 4 years. He was the external authentication. I was the internal architecture. When he died, I lost the external piece. I have been waiting for someone to bring it back." She looked at Lena directly. "You're the external piece." Lena had about 3 seconds to absorb this. Then Garrett's voice came through the earbud, sharper now. "Position 2 is moving. He's heading for the stairwell. You have got to move right now." Lena pulled Sylvie into the corridor. They moved toward the southeast stairwell. The secondary stairs, the ones that did not connect to the lobby level and fed instead into the parking structure on the building's south side. They were on floor 5 when Position 3's replacement reached sub-basement and found his partner on the floor. She heard it on the radio at her lapel. The voice was controlled, professional. A single-clip transmission. "Position 3 is down. Interior breach. Confirmed. All positions alert." Then the second transmission, 10 seconds later, from a different voice. Older. Harder, the voice of someone who had given orders under fire and knew what it sounded like when a situation shifted from managed to active. "Collapse 2. Secondary, 2 and 8 cover south exit. 6 takes the principal. Nobody moves the principal until I say." She processed this while moving. Collapse to secondary meant the perimeter was folding inward, concentrating force at the most likely exit points and around Sylvie. It was the correct tactical response to an unidentified interior breach. It was what she would have ordered. It was also going to seal the parking structure exit in less than 4 minutes. She stopped on floor 3 landing. She said to Sylvie, "Stay here, do not move, do not make a sound." Sylvie said, "I've been not making sounds for 3 days. I can manage 4 more minutes." Lena went back up 1 floor. She needed elevation. She needed line of sight to the building's emergency lighting transformer, which was located in the electrical room on floor 4. Adjacent to the east stairwell, Garrett had pulled the building's electrical permit from 2004. The transformer was bolted to the east wall, the access panel. In the floor 4 supply closet, connected to the ventilation chase running parallel to the corridor. She went through the supply closet, found the access panel, found the transformer housing behind the chase partition by feel, located the primary bus bar, identified the circuit breakers for the emergency lighting grid on floors 3 through 8 from the panel labels that were still legible under a layer of dust. She tripped floors 3 through 8. The emergency lighting in that section of the building went dark. Not completely dark. The battery backup systems on floors 1 and 2 maintained. The lobby, the roof lighting maintained, but floors 3 through 8 dropped to the ambient light from the exterior windows, which at this hour and in this weather was approximately nothing. Garrett's voice, quiet and fast. "That bought you something, 2 of the 6. Inbound positions just stopped moving, they're recalibrating." A pause, then. "Lena, I have a command frequency transmission I just intercepted. Someone high up the chain queried the team leader directly, not through the normal channel. Through a frequency I have not seen in this operation before. And Lena, it's routing through a DoD administrative network node, not a tactical channel. An administrative one, budget authorizations, someone in a desk job just issued a tactical order." She said, "Record it." Already running. She went back down to floor 3. She found Sylvie exactly where she had left her, back against the wall, phone dark in her hand, completely still. Lena gave her credit for that. Not everyone could hold still in the dark when they understood what was outside the door. Then Lena activated the fire alarm. Not from a pull station, from the junction box on the floor 3 landing, which Garrett had located for her from the 2019 fire suppression permit update. She had the panel open in under a minute and found the manual trigger relay. She bridged it with a piece of wire from the kit in her jacket. The alarm was loud. It was designed to be loud. That was the point. A fire alarm in a 12-story residential building at midnight produces one universal response in trained security personnel. It is either a genuine emergency or it is a diversionary tactic, and either way you do not move your principal toward an exit, because exits are where people die in fire alarm scenarios. Every professional in that building had been trained to hold position on an alarm. She heard the hesitation in position, Six's voice on the radio when he queried the team leader asking for clarification. The team leader said hold, position. Six said copy, but the half-second delay before he said it told her everything she needed to know about where his attention was going. She had the darkness pulling 2 positions into stationary recalibration. She had the alarm pulling 2 more into hold. She needed one final disruption. She keyed position 3's radio, the one she had taken from the man in the sub-basement, and transmitted on the command frequency in a clipped flat voice. 6, this is 3. I need you on the north stairwell. I've got movement above. 8, possible second breach. Position 3 was down and silent. No one on the team knew what her voice sounded like. The transmission was brief enough and the situation urgent enough that Position 6 had to decide with incomplete information. He moved toward the north stairwell. She moved toward the south. She came back to Sylvie and said one word, now. They went down. The parking level was dim, emergency lighting only, the vehicle standing in. Rose like something patient and waiting. She moved Sylvie between the cars, using the sightline brakes between vehicle rooflines to stay below the angle that positions 2 and 8 would be covering at the south exit ramp. There was a structural column at the 15-meter mark on the west side of the ramp, load-bearing 3 feet in diameter, 2004 construction concrete. It created a dead zone in the coverage angle of anyone standing at the top of the ramp looking down. Second gap. She moved Sylvie through it, keeping her close to the column, timed to the moment Garrett told her position. 8 had shifted 2 steps left in response to something on his radio. They came out the south exit and into the alley. Garrett had the van at the alley entrance, engine running, lights off. She put Sylvie in the back and got in the front. She said, go. He went. They were 4 blocks from the building when she looked at the thermal feed on Garrett's dash-mounted screen one more time. She had not forgotten what she had filed before she went up the stairs. Position 9 had dropped from the building's thermal envelope before she entered, before the radio check, before the collapse order, before any of the chaos she had triggered. Position 9 had left voluntarily. Before any alarm went off, before the team knew there was a breach, before anyone had a reason to move. He had gone out the roof access on the rear of the building, dropped to the fire escape and left, and he had done it at the exact moment she entered through the sub-basement below. As if he knew she was coming. As if he had been waiting for her to enter before he exited. She thought about that left leg drag. She thought about 2 years of watching it move through terrain. She thought about a memorial service in the rain. Garrett said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I need to know if your van has a secondary tracking vulnerability. Something on the chassis you didn't check." He took one hand off the wheel and reached under the seat, came up with a signal scanner, ran it across the dash, the window seals, his own jacket. Then he said, "Undercarriage, I'll need to stop." He stopped in a parking structure 3 blocks east. She held the scanner while he rolled under the van with a flashlight. It took 4 minutes. He came out holding a military-grade GSM tracker, matte black, no commercial markings. He said, "This has been active since before Billings, before I left to go to your cabin. This is a prepositioning device. Someone knew I was going to that cabin before Orson showed up." She looked at the tracker in his hand, active for well over 30 hours. Planted before Orson left Billings, planted before the handoff had even been scheduled, not a reactive measure, a preemptive one. The enemy had not been waiting for them to act. The enemy had been waiting for this exact sequence to begin, from the first moment Orson decided to move, because someone in the architecture of this situation had known the architecture well enough to monitor it from the inside. She filed it. She did not yet have a name for the shape of it. They drove. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in 40 minutes. The left shoulder was burning along the full length of the tier. She pressed her hand against it and said nothing. Garrett was already talking, low and fast, eyes on the road. That command frequency transmission I captured, routed through an OSD administrative node. The kind that runs budget approvals and procurement authorizations. He paused. Someone in a desk job issued a tactical order to a 9-person kill team. That is not a coincidence with what your father's file described. That is the same structure operating the same way it operated in 2007. From the back of the van, Sylvie's voice. That's consistent with what I've been building for 3 years. One of the routing approvals in my documentation has an authorization code I have never been able to attach to a name. The authorization belongs to an OSD analyst whose personnel file is restricted above my clearance level. Then Lena's phone buzzed. Orson Greer's number. She answered. His voice was tight in a way she had never heard from him, not at the funeral. Not in the blizzard outside her cabin. He said, I need you to hear something. Before you get further, something I should have said when I was at your cabin. And couldn't. She said, say it. The SD card, the instruction to bring it to you now this week. It was not Dennis's original plan. Dennis's plan was that I hold it until I judged the moment correct, until I decided. He stopped. 8 months ago a man contacted me, said he had been part of your father's network, said the window was closing, and I needed to move the card to you now. I believed him because he knew details about Dennis that I thought only Dennis and I knew. He stopped again. Lena. I don't know who I was really working for. I thought I was carrying out Dennis's plan. I may have been carrying out someone else's. The van was moving west on Burnside, the streetlights passing overhead in even intervals, light and dark and light. She said, did you call anyone before you drove to my cabin? No. Did you stop anywhere? One gas station, outside Missoula. She thought about the tracker, active before Orson left Billings. Someone had known his plan before he executed it, which meant either they had been monitoring Orson for months, or the person who contacted him 8 months ago and told him to move was the same person who had prepositioned the tracker on Garrett's van. The same person had set everything in motion. She said, there's a 5th name on the evidence file. My father's recording mentioned 4 principals. You're telling me someone with detailed knowledge of Dennis's operational planning directed your timing. That person is either the 5th name or they work for the 5th name. Silence on the line. Then Orson said, there's something else. She waited. I have a brother, Walter, younger by 6 years. He works for the office of the Secretary of Defense, Budget and Procurement Analysis, has for 16 years. He stopped. I have not spoken to him in 3 years. We had a falling out over something I cannot explain without explaining everything, but I want you to know that his name exists in the universe of this situation. I don't know how. I am not saying I know how. I am saying I want you to know it exists. She looked at the road ahead. She said, Orson, are you safe right now? I'm in a motel in North Portland. I drove here after I left you. I didn't know why. I think I needed to be closer. Stay there, lock the door. Don't use your phone again tonight unless it's me calling you. She ended the call. Garrett said without looking up from the road. Walter Greer, OSD budget. Analysis. That office processes and approves defense contract payments, including Meridian Group payments, if the contracts were routed through the correct vehicle. He paused. If someone in that office approved those payments 6 fiscal years running, that is not an oversight. That is architecture. From the back, Sylvie said quietly, the authorization code I cannot identify. The one attached to the restricted personnel file. She paused. If it belongs to a GS-15 budget analyst in OSD, that would explain why my clearance could not open the file. Budget analysts at that grade have a separate restricted personnel category if they handle procurement oversight for classified contract vehicles. The van was moving. The city was thinning. The industrial waterfront appeared. On the south side, the Columbia dark and wide beyond it. Nobody spoke for a full block. Then the rear door handle moved. All three of them registered it at the same moment. Lena had the M40A6 unsealed and the safety off before Garrett finished braking to the curb. The rear door opened from outside. The man who climbed in was 6'1", broad through the shoulders, moving with the economy of someone once highly trained who had kept most of it. Both hands were visible, open, held away from his body at the angle that means I am showing you something intentional. He was wearing civilian clothes with no tactical markings, no weapon visible. He was 31 years old. He had a scar that ran from the left corner of his mouth to his jawline, a scar that was not there the last time she had seen his face. And he walked with a slight drag on the left side that she had seen in the thermal imagery hours ago and had filed without speaking. He looked at her. She looked at him. Corporal Tanner Doyle, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, her spotter for 2 deployments, the man she had watched burn in a vehicle IED strike in Helmand Province, September 2020, the same day her shoulder tore, the man whose name she had said aloud at a memorial service in front of his photograph and a folded flag, and 300 people who had never known him the way she had known him. He said, I know what you're thinking. She said nothing. He said, I've been thinking the same thing for 3 years. He did not look away. I was pulled out of that vehicle 40 minutes before the IED triggered. A private contractor team. They had my name, my biometrics, a new identity already built. They told me my family would be used against me if I refused. Or if I talked. I believed them. I had reason to believe them. He let his hands lower slightly. Tonight was the first time I knew the job I was taking was connected to your father. I didn't know until 6 hours ago when I saw the tracker readout, when I saw your name. Garrett spoke quietly from the front, not turning. The tracker, he had team access to the tracker data. Tanner said, I was monitoring the van's GPS from my position. When I saw your name on the mission brief 6 hours ago, I made a decision. I went out through the roof access on the rear of the building before the breach alert. Before anything activated, I dropped to the fire escape and followed the van on foot until I had a window to get close enough. He looked at Lena. I gave you every opening I could without being visible about it. Position 9's coverage had a gap I widened by shifting my angle 30 degrees west each time I reported in. I reported Position 6's location on the team channel in a way that gave you the corridor. I could not make it more obvious without triggering a query From the team leader. She thought about the openings she had found on floors 6 and 7. Clean. Angles where she had expected resistance. She had attributed them to the darkness and the alarm creating confusion. She had been half right. He said, I've been waiting 3 years for a reason to stop. I thought I wouldn't find one, and then I saw your name. He looked at his hands. I'm done. I'm not fighting you. She did not speak for a long moment. She thought about a memorial service and a folded flag, and 3 years of specific weight that had a specific shape inside her chest. She thought about what her father had said. I am sorry I taught you to carry things alone. She thought, this man has been carrying something alone for 3 years too. She reached into her jacket and brought out the handcuff pouch. One cuff, she attached it to his left wrist, the other end to the cargo loop on the van's interior wall. His right wrist remained free. He looked at the arrangement, then he looked at her. She said, talk. He talked. The man who had recruited him into Meridian Group's security arm had been a former Delta Force logistics officer working under a contractor identity he had never been able to verify. Tanner had been given 4 operational assignments in 3 years. All 4 had the same structure: contain a specific individual, wait for the order, do not act without it. The order for Sylvie Drummond had been pending for 11 days. It had not come. Tanner believed it had not come because something at the top of the chain was in motion, a decision being made above the contractor, above Prudhoe, above Ashford, and that decision required a specific sequence to complete before the execution order could be issued. He said, there is a 5th principle. I have never had a name, but on every assignment there is a ghost at the top of the authorization chain, someone who approves the order before it goes to the contractor, someone who has desk authority over the whole structure. He looked at Sylvie. He said, I spent 3 years waiting for a reason to stop. I didn't think I'd find one. And then I saw her name on the brief, and I thought about what your father built and what it meant that it had survived this long, and I thought, this is the one. This is the thing worth stopping for. The van was quiet. A bus went past on the street outside. The world beyond the windows was doing what it always did, moving through the dark, indifferent and continuous. She had believed him, not because the story was simple or clean, because she had watched him for 2 years in terrain that was trying to kill them both, and she knew with the certainty that comes from that kind of proximity, the exact sound of the truth in his voice. Garrett had turned in his seat and was looking at Tanner with the expression of someone rebuilding a significant number of assumptions. Then Garrett said quietly, Pearson Field, I have a plane staged, 11 minutes from here, on the Washington side. Patricia Wald prepositioned it. She said, who is Patricia Wald? Garrett said, that is a conversation that needs to happen in the air. She looked at the building they had left, now 3 miles behind them in the dark. 9 positions, 3 neutralized, 6 dissolved by confusion, 1 defected, a containment structure that was no longer containing anything. She thought 4 gaps. She had used all 4, the culvert, the structural column in the parking ramp, the fire alarm pulling 6 toward the wrong stairwell, and Tanner, who had been the 4th gap all along, built into the perimeter by a contractor who had not considered what 3 years of proximity to an injustice does to a man who still knows what he is. Her father's voice from somewhere in her memory. The enemy knows the map. He does not know the territory. The territory had included Tanner Doyle. She said, "Drive." He drove. They were moving south on a surface road toward the Columbia when Garrett checked his scanner and said, without changing his tone, "Two black SUVs. No plates, coming out of the interchange, moving to intercept." He looked at his screen. Someone triangulated the cell signal, Orson's call. She said, "How far to Pearson?" 7 minutes. She looked at the road ahead, looked at the van's rear door, thought about angles and distance, and a shoulder that still burned along its full length. She unsealed the M40A6 from the canvas sleeve, checked the chamber, confirmed the scope. The SUVs were behind them now, moving fast, closing the gap in the purposeful way of vehicles that have a destination and not a question. She said to Tanner, "Third vehicle." He said without hesitation, "No, they run in pairs. Third unit stays at command." She accepted that. She opened the van's rear door. The highway air came in cold and loud. She settled the bipod on the door frame, felt the vehicle's suspension cycle under her, read the wind coming off the river, and built the calculation the way she had built 1,000 calculations in 2 deployments, and in the frozen grass above Elk, and in the dark of a sub-basement where a man had been breathing in a pattern she had learned at 19 years old. The conditions that existed: a moving van at highway speed, a crosswind at 14 knots off the Columbia, 2 target vehicles at 280 and 310 meters closing, drivers trained for pursuit, not for target, coming from the rear of their own pursuit vehicle. She was not going to shoot drivers. She was going to shoot tires. Not because she was unwilling to do anything else, because 2 disabled SUVs left the people inside them alive, and alive people could eventually answer questions, and questions answered under oath in a federal proceeding were worth considerably more than bodies, which answered nothing. Her father's voice: "Aim at the truth, not the target." She thought, "I am beginning to understand." The lead SUV was at 280 meters. She compensated for the van's vibration by reading the suspension oscillation rhythm and timing the shot to the bottom of the cycle. She exhaled to the natural respiratory pause, the 2-second window between exhale and the body's next involuntary breath. Her left shoulder held the position. She squeezed. The front left tire of the lead SUV came apart. The vehicle went hard left. Overcorrected, hit the median barrier at an angle that spun it sideways and stopped it across 2 lanes. She had judged the angle. She rechambered. The trailing SUV was opening distance, the driver responding, moving to a pursuit angle that would complicate a second shot. She tracked him for 4 seconds, reading his line. She released on the 3rd correction. The rear right tire of the second SUV shredded. The vehicle pulled right, braked hard, came to rest on the shoulder in a cloud of rubber and smoke. Garrett said, "I'm never questioning your shoulder again." She said, "It still hurts." He said, "You just did that from a moving van at over 300 meters." She said, "I know." She closed the rear door. She sat back and pressed her palm against the left shoulder and breathed. The pain was at its own level, the level she had named a long time ago and had decided did not constitute a reason to stop. Tanner was behind her, one wrist cuffed, one free, watching the high recede. Sylvie was quiet in the back with her token on its cord in her 11 years of patience still intact. Garrett had both hands on the wheel, and the Pearson Field beacon pulling up on his navigation screen. The lights of Vancouver, Washington appeared ahead across the Columbia. She thought about the fifth name that was not yet on any file. She thought about Walter Greer in an office in Washington, authorized to move money and apparently authorized to move people. She thought about Orson Greer in a motel room in North Portland, alone with a name he had not been able to say for 3 years. Then Garrett said, "Lena, there's a vehicle already parked at Pearson. Engine running, lights off. I didn't put it there." She looked. A dark sedan on the general aviation apron. One occupant, still. Then the driver's window came down. Garrett said, "I don't know who that is." She looked at the vehicle, the engine running in the dark, the window open in the cold, the patience of someone who had been waiting and was not afraid that the waiting showed. Above them at the south end of the field, movement on thermal. Garrett caught it first, 3 shapes moving fast from the direction of the city, the 3 positions she had sent to the wrong floor. Someone had found the trajectory. Cell triangulation, or a secondary tracker she had missed, or the command structure above Prudhoe had more reach than she had measured. 12 seconds, maybe 15. The dark sedan, engine running, a person she did not know, and behind her, closing fast, 3 people who knew exactly who she was and what she was carrying. She looked at the vehicle. She thought about gaps. She thought about territory the enemy does not know. She thought about her father building this plan to last 11 years through his own death. She thought he would not have left an open door without knowing who was standing in it. From inside the sedan, a woman's voice, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. 4 words. "Dennis sent me to." 12 seconds. She reached for the door handle. She got in the car. Not because she trusted the woman in the sedan, not because 4 words were sufficient to override every instinct she had built across 2 deployments and 14 months of living close enough to the ground to understand what silence cost. She got in because her father had built this plan across 11 years and across his own death, and because a plan built that carefully does not end with an unresolved door. It ends with a door you walk through. And because behind her at the south end of Pearson Field, 3 shapes were moving through the dark with the formation precision of people who had been told where to go and had been told not to leave anyone standing when they got there. She opened the rear door and Sylvie was already moving. Garrett came in from the other side. Tanner came last, one wrist still wearing the cuff she had not removed, and he pulled the door closed and said nothing. The woman drove before anyone asked her to. Her name was Patricia Wald, 54 years old, former senior investigator with the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General, specifically the Procurement Integrity Division. She stated this the way a person states something they have rehearsed many times for one specific moment, clearly and without preamble, her eyes moving between the road ahead and the rearview mirror in measured intervals, driving with the deliberate precision of someone who had studied this route before tonight and knew every turn before it arrived. She said, "I was removed from my position in 2017. I had been investigating Meridian Group for 19 months using every authorized channel available to me. My investigation was terminated without stated cause. My files were transferred to a restricted archive I no longer had clearance to access, and I was separated from federal service on a performance review that directly contradicted every evaluation I had received in the prior 9 years. She turned north on a surface road running parallel to the Columbia. The airfield behind them dissolved into the distance without headlights following. She said, "I have been conducting this investigation independently for 7 years, my own resources, my own time, my own money. I maintained access to one legacy building management system in Portland through a credential that was issued before 2004, registered to an old GSA infrastructure account that was never migrated to the federal government's post-2015 unified credential architecture. Legacy systems like that one fall through the deprovisioning process when agencies update. Nobody closes a door they cannot see." I reactivated the building's fire suppression system using that credential 40 minutes before you arrived. It was not protective altruism. It was risk management for an asset I needed intact. From the back, Lena's voice came flat and precise. "You used him, Orson." "Yes. You used me." Yes, no hesitation, no apology in the word itself, though something in the space around it was more complicated than simple absence of remorse. I needed someone who could reach Sylvie and extract her, and who had personal motive sufficient to actually complete the operation against a 9-person professional containment team. I could not do that myself. I have institutional knowledge and 7 years of independent evidence. I do not have your particular set of capabilities. She looked in the rearview mirror for 1 second. Dennis raised the right person for this. I made use of what he raised. I am telling you this directly because you are owed that, and because I am not going to spend the next several hours pretending I did something other than what I did. The car was quiet. Then Lena said, "Where are we going?" Patricia said, "I have a plane staged at a private strip 12 miles east, owned by a man who owes me a professional debt from before my removal and who asks no questions. We will be in the air in 40 minutes. Our destination is Bethesda, Maryland. I have 2 federal judges and a sitting inspector general from the Defense Logistics Agency who have agreed to receive and authenticate a complete evidence package. They are meeting us because they trust the chain of custody I have built over 7 years, and because they understand that when this moment arrived, it would be the kind of case that defines a career, either the career they end by refusing, or the one they build by accepting. From beside Lena, Sylvie said quietly, "You built the external reception. I built the internal evidence." Patricia said, "Dennis built the bridge between you." Nobody said anything for a while after that. The Columbia appeared on the left, dark and wide, moving south toward the Pacific at a pace that suggested the river had seen urgency before and had decided long ago not to be unsettled by it. Lena looked out the window and thought about her father in a back bedroom in Bozeman, recording his voice onto a chip the size of a fingernail, knowing that the cardiac event that would kill him in 6 months was not going to be a cardiac event, knowing that everything he had built depended on a chain of people he had chosen carefully and trusted completely, knowing that the last Link in that chain was a 23-year-old who had come back from a war with a torn shoulder and a grief she had been carrying the only way he had ever taught her to carry anything, alone. She thought he knew I would get in the car. She thought he built me to get in the car. And then she thought about what that cost him to know. The airstrip was a cleared field with a single corrugated metal hangar and a grass runway lit by 2 rows of portable LED stakes placed within the last hour. The plane was a Cessna Citation CJ-2, a light business jet 7 passenger capacity, the kind of aircraft that moves people between cities without appearing in the records that larger aircraft generate. A man in his 60s stood at the hangar door, nodded once at Patricia, and went inside without looking at anyone else. They boarded. Garrett transferred his operation to the plane's power system and was running queries before the wheels left the ground. Tanner sat in the rear-facing seat. Across from Lena, she removed the cuff without ceremony. He rubbed his wrist once, then folded his hands on his knees and looked out the window at the darkness rising below the plane as it climbed east. At 11,000 feet, Sylvie Drummond took the token from the cord around her neck, a small device matte black the size of a shirt button with a single micro USB port and a recessed LED that was currently dark. She held it in her palm for a moment, the way you hold something that has taken a very long time to carry to its destination. Then she looked at Patricia. Patricia opened her bag and produced a laptop and a small authentication reader. She plugged the reader into the laptop. She said, "When you're ready." Sylvie inserted the token. The LED came on, green. Then Sylvie spoke her passphrase, 12 words spoken in a normal voice into the laptop's microphone, words she had chosen in 2017 and had said in her mind every morning since. The voiceprint analysis ran for 8 seconds. The dead drop server opened. The file was 340 megabytes, evidence built across 11 years by 2 people who had never met in person. Dennis Harwick's operational documentation, chain of custody records, field notes, intercepted communications, and a photographic record of the compound in Kandahar province from before and after October 14, 2007. Sylvie Drummond's analytical case, built from inside the DIA's own systems across 11 years of careful, invisible work. 3. Financial routing documents, reconstructed from memory and cross-verified against public procurement records, voice recordings, signed affidavits from 2 former Meridian Group employees located by Patricia through 7 years of quiet, independent work. And at the center of the financial routing structure, in the authorization field of 6 consecutive fiscal year procurement approvals spanning 2009 through 2014, a code attached to a restricted personnel file that Sylvie had never been able to open. Patricia opened it. She had the clearance. She had obtained it through a federal judge who had reviewed her petition in camera 3 weeks prior and had granted limited discovery access to the personnel records associated with the Meridian Group contract authorization chain, a judge who had spent 14 years waiting for a case built solidly enough to act on. The file opened. The name in the authorization field, across all 6 fiscal years, all $3.1 billion, all the deaths and the silences and the staged accidents and the bodies that had accumulated in the space between a defense contract, and the conscience of the people who signed it was this: Walter R. Greer, GS-15 Budget Analysis Division, Office of the Secretary of Defense. Orson's brother. The plane held its altitude and its heading. The engine note did not change. Outside the windows, the country below was dark and unknowing and enormous. Garrett was the first to speak. He said it as a statement of fact without. He processed every payment, 6 years, every routing approval. He was the desk that made the money move. Sylvie said, he was also the one who restricted my access when I filed the internal query in 2016. The restriction originated from his authorization level. I could not identify whose level it was until now. Patricia said nothing. She was looking at the name on the screen with an expression Lena had not seen on her face before tonight. Not satisfaction, not vindication. The exhaustion of someone who has spent 7 years carrying the weight of an unanswered question and has just been handed the answer, and has discovered that answers are heavier than questions in the moment of their arrival. Lena looked at the name for a long time. She thought about Orson in a motel room in North Portland, alone with what he had said on the phone. I have a brother, Walter. She thought about the way he had said it, not as confession and not as accusation, as something he had found in his pocket and did not know how to put down. She took out her phone. She called him. He answered on the second ring. His voice was awake. He had not been sleeping. She said, Walter R. Greer, GS-15 OSD Budget Analysis, Authorization Codes. On 6 consecutive Meridian Group procurement approvals, 2009 through 2014. Every payment, $3.1 billion. She stopped speaking. Outside the window, somewhere below the cloud layer, the eastern Oregon Plateau was passing in the dark. She watched it without seeing it. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. He said, I know. The plane engine held its steady note. Below them somewhere the country moved. Through its own night, indifferent and continuous. She said, how long? I found out 6 months ago, a benefits discrepancy in the VA database. I was helping Walter with a paperwork issue. I accessed a record I was not supposed to access. I saw something I could not explain. I followed it until I understood what it was. He stopped. The pause was the pause of a man measuring what he is about to say against every version of himself he has ever tried to be. And then I sat with it for 6 months. I told myself I was building certainty. I told myself I needed to be sure before I said anything to anyone. He stopped again. She waited. The truth is I was afraid, not of Walter, of what it meant that I had not seen it sooner, that I had been carrying that card for 5 years and all that time my own brother was on the other side of what your father died for. His voice did not break. It did something more precise than breaking. It became very quiet and very level, the register of a man controlling a large grief through the only instrument he had available, which was the discipline of a former Marine gunnery sergeant who had learned that some things you hold until you can set them down properly, and that the manner of setting them down matters more than the relief of doing it. She said, is that why you delivered the card? Because you found out about Walter? Partly, he let out a breath. Partly because a woman named Patricia Wald called me and knew things she had no right to know, and told me the window was Closing, but yes, partly because I found Walter's name in that record and I thought, if I don't move now, I will be carrying two things instead of one. And I don't know that I'm strong enough for two. Garrett had turned in his seat just slightly, not intruding but present. Tanner was still, looking at his hands. She said, Orson, what you did tonight, driving to my cabin, delivering that card, telling me the truth on the phone about not knowing who sent you. All of it, does it become something different because of what Walter chose? Silence. Lena looked out the window. The cloud layer had broken below them and she could see the faint grid of a small city far below, lit orange and incomplete, the way all things look from a distance that removes the detail. She said, it doesn't. You carried something for 5 years at Dennis Harwick's request because Dennis Harwick asked you to. That is not made smaller by what your brother decided in an office in Washington. Those are two separate accountings, they don't combine. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he told me once, Dennis, he said, the only thing harder than doing the right thing is watching someone you love do the wrong one and knowing the two facts have to live in the same world. She sat with that. The plane moved east. She said he was right. She said, I need you in Bethesda, not today, in the days after when this gets complicated in the ways it's going to get complicated. I need someone who knew him, someone who can say what he was. Orson said, I'll be there. She ended the call. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. Garrett made no comment. Sylvie was looking out the window on the opposite side of the plane. Patricia had closed the evidence file and was sitting with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular, allowing the moment its space. Tanner said quietly enough that only she could hear it, your shoulder. She said, I know. He said, I've been watching you not mention it for 3 hours. She said, I wasn't not mentioning it, I was using it. He looked at her sideways, in the old way, the way he had looked at her across 200 meters of terrain, and across 2 years of being the person whose job it was to know where she was and what she was seeing at all times. The way. That means I have an assessment, and I am deciding whether the moment requires me to say it. He said, I'll be around when you figure out what comes next. She said, I know you will. She looked out the window. They landed at a private airstrip outside Frederick, Maryland at 5:47 in the morning. A car was waiting. Patricia drove. The sky to the east had begun the process of becoming day, a thin gray differentiation at the horizon that had not yet committed to light, but had stopped being entirely dark. The location Patricia had arranged was a federal records facility in Bethesda, operated under the authority of the Defense Logistics Agency's Office of Inspector General, a building that appeared from the outside to be nothing more than a nondescript 3-story office structure on a street of similar buildings. Inside, 2 federal judges who had driven from their homes before dawn, the sitting Inspector General of the Defense Logistics Agency, a man in his late 50s named Harlan Moss, who had the manner of someone who had been waiting for a case like this for most of a long career and had kept himself available to receive it without making a public matter of the waiting. 2 federal marshals stood at the door, patient, present. Their job was to be witness to important moments without becoming part of them. The authentication took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Sylvie's verbal testimony was recorded and corroborated against the reconstructed documents in real time by both judges and by a forensic financial analyst from the DLA Inspector General's office who had been read into the case 3 days prior. The voiceprint authentication against the dead drop server was verified by a digital forensic specialist who examined the server's access logs and confirmed that the file had been created and sealed at the date Sylvie had specified, using credentials traceable to a DIA access certificate in her name that had never been revoked. Patricia's 7 years of independent documentation was entered into the record. Its chain of custody examined by both judges and found complete. The two former Meridian Group employees whose affidavits she had obtained were contacted by phone in real time and confirmed the statements. The financial routing through Walter Greer's authorization codes was cross-checked against 6 fiscal year procurement records obtained under the prior discovery order and against the electronic signature logs in the DoD financial management system. The match was unrebutted and complete. Lena Harwick's audio file was authenticated by a voice analysis specialist and formally entered into the evidentiary record. His field documentation and the photographic record of the compound in Kandahar province were verified against satellite imagery from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Archives imagery requested under seal by one of the judges and delivered overnight by an agency archivist who had been waiting for exactly this kind of lawful request for a very long time. At 10:14 in the morning, Inspector General Harlan Moss looked up from the final document and said, in a room that had been completely silent for several minutes, "This is a complete evidentiary record. It is sufficient." He said it the way a man says something he has wanted to say for a long time, with a quietness that contained a great deal of controlled feeling, and released none of it into the room. Then he picked up his phone. What followed happened the way large things happen when they have been prepared for carefully and built from the ground up with sufficient patience, not dramatically, with the steady procedural movement of federal authority exercised by people who understand how to use it. Colonel Vance Prudhoe was taken into custody at his private security firm's offices in Tysons, Virginia at 11:47 in the morning. He did not resist. He looked at the federal marshals and at the document they presented, and then he sat down in his chair. He had spent 17 years building a structure around what he had done in Kandahar in 2007, and the structure had been dismantled in 4 hours in a building 3 miles away. He had always known in the part of himself he had kept very quiet that structures built on the deaths of 13 people do not hold forever. They hold until someone cares enough and has enough to take them apart. Senator Boyd Ashford's office was raided at 12:03 in the afternoon by a joint team from the FBI and the DLA Inspector General's office. Ashford was at a campaign fundraiser at a hotel in Georgetown. His chief of staff called him. He came back to his office and met the federal marshals at the building entrance and accepted the document. He was a politician who had a lawyer. The lawyer was in the car within 12 minutes of notification. None of that would matter. And Ashford understood that it would not matter, and the understanding showed in his face in a way that 12 years in public office could not fully conceal. Walter Greer was arrested at his home in Arlington at 11:52 in the morning. 23 minutes before a tip reached a financial news outlet he had apparently been preparing to contact with a preemptive statement. The marshals arrived before the tip was sent. He was in his kitchen making coffee. He came to the door in civilian clothes. He looked at the document the marshals presented. He read it fully. He set his coffee cup on the counter with a precision that suggested he was concentrating very carefully on doing one ordinary thing correctly in a moment that had ceased to be ordinary. Then he went with the marshals without a word. He did not ask to call his brother. Lena learned about Walter's arrest from Garrett, who had a federal database tap running on a laptop in the corner of the authentication room and was monitoring the cascade of warrant executions flowing from the documentation. They had delivered. He said her name quietly. She looked over. He turned the laptop so she could see the arrest log entry. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Orson somewhere between Portland and Bethesda, driving toward a city where his brother had just been taken from a kitchen by federal marshals. She thought about what it would feel like to be that man on that road, to have carried your loyalty to Lena Harwick for 5 years and to find that the loyalty that finally dismantled the cover was your own. To arrive at the truth and find that the truth contains a name you raised alongside you. She thought, some things you hold until you can set them down properly. She thought he set it down. She stepped out of the building alone. The morning was cold. The street outside the Bethesda facility was quiet in the way of a street in a city where important work happens inside buildings. And the street has learned not to ask what. A few cars, a woman walking a dog who did not look up, the world moving through its indifference in the way it always does when something large has just shifted underneath it. She put her right hand in her jacket pocket, found the photograph she had carried it from Montana through the culvert and the stairwells and the highway and the airstrip and 4 hours of federal authentication, and it was still there, slightly bent at one corner, the dress blues, the location she had never been told, the expression that had refused for 40 years to lie to a camera. She turned it over. Aim at the truth, not the target. She had been reading this sentence since she was 11 years old. She had found the photograph in her father's dresser drawer and asked him what it meant. And he had said it means exactly what it says, and she had believed him, and she had spent 15 years understanding it as a principle of marksmanship. Patience, precision. You are not shooting at the thing in your scope. You are shooting at the truth behind it. She understood now that he had been writing about himself. He had been a man who spent decades in service to a structure that turned out to contain something he could not reconcile with what he believed service meant. He had found the moment where those two things became irreconcilable, and he had made a choice, not a clean choice, not a simple one. He had filed a report through proper channels, and the proper channels had buried it, and then he had spent 11 years building a case by every rule of evidence and patience and precision that he had tried his entire life to live by. He had aimed at the truth across 11 years and across his own death, at everything it cost him. And it had not failed. The door behind her opened. Garrett came out with 2 cups of coffee from wherever he had found coffee inside a federal records building at 11 in the morning, which told her something she had already suspected about his particular talent for producing practical things in unlikely places. He held one out. She took it. He stood beside her and looked at the street. He had the quality of someone who understood that some moments needed to be stood in rather than filled, and who had enough discipline to stand in them without filling them. She had not expected that from him in the parking lot outside Red Lodge 14 hours ago. She had been revising her assessment steadily since Portland. After a while she said, "My father told you things about me." "He said some things." She said, "What did he say?" He thought about it for a moment, took a sip of his coffee. "He said you were the most patient person he had ever trained. He said you could hold still longer than anyone he had known, and that you never confused stillness with inaction. He said you understood that waiting was a form of pressure." He paused. He said, "You had your mother's stubbornness and his worst habit of carrying everything alone, and that the combination would either get you killed or make you exactly the right person for something important." He said he had never been able to determine which one it was going to be. She said nothing for a moment. She said he figured it out. Garrett said he figured it out. The door opened again. Inspector General Harlan Moss stepped out, buttoning his coat against the morning cold. He looked at Lena with the direct regard of a man who evaluates people quickly as a professional discipline and has recently made a significant revision. He said, "The full evidence record will be entered into the federal docket within 24 hours. Both judges are executing the formal authentication documents this afternoon. The arrest warrants are executing, as you can see. Your father's name will be entered into the record as the originating documentarian of the core evidentiary file. His service record will be corrected to accurately reflect the circumstances of his death. That process takes time, but I will make certain it moves." She said he deserved better than a corrected record. He said, "Yes, he did. Most men who do what he did deserve better than the world gives them. That doesn't make the record unimportant. It makes it insufficient. But it's what the system can give him, and I intend to make certain the system gives it fully." She accepted that, not as enough as what was true. He went back inside. She stood with her coffee and the photograph in her pocket and the beartooth. Range 4 states west, and her father's voice somewhere in the permanent storage of her memory saying hatchling in a voice that meant 4 things simultaneously and had always meant all 4 at once. Tanner came out 10 minutes later and stood to her right, not close, the right distance, which was the distance they had always kept on Overwatch. Her left, his right, her eye, his scope, the same geometry in a different world. He said, "They're going to want statements, both of us." She said, "I know." He said, "After that, what do you do?" She thought about the photograph, the inscription, the thing she had misunderstood for 15 years and now understood completely, which was not the comfort she might have expected it to be. Understanding a thing does not make its cost smaller, it makes the cost clear, and clarity is not the same as relief. She thought about Patricia Wald's 7 years of solitary work. She thought about Sylvie Drummond's 11 years of embedded architecture. She thought about Orson carrying a lead-lined case in a boot inside a locked footlocker for 5 years because one man had asked him to. She thought about what Garrett had said in the van on the highway south of Portland, quietly and without drama, in the way he delivered information that he considered operationally significant. Someone in a desk job issued a tactical Order to a 9-person containment team, same structure, same pattern. She said, I don't know yet. He looked at her sideways, the assessment look, deciding whether the moment required the statement he had already formed. He said, I think you do know. She said nothing. He said, I'll be around when you're ready. She said, I know. She went back inside. 3 weeks later, she was on the ridge above Red Lodge. The same exposed granite ledge where she had sat on the first morning of the previous October and watched the light come up across the Beartooth Range and had thought for the first time in her adult life that she might be done with all of it, done with the weight of other people's decisions and the cost of things that happened in rooms she had never been in, done with carrying. She had thought that for 14 months. The snow was coming down in the slow vertical way that means it will continue. For hours, the valley below was already white. The pines along the north ridge were holding their loads with the patience that is not patience at all but simply the nature of things that do not have a choice. She heard the van before she saw it. Garrett parked at the trailhead below and climbed the ridge in the snow without being asked and without explaining himself. He had 2 cups of coffee in a carrier from a place in Billings she recognized. He handed her one and sat on the granite beside her at the right distance and said nothing. They drank their coffee. The snow fell. After a while he said, Patricia filed the full Meridian Network map with the DOJ last week. Complete architecture, 9 additional contract vehicles, 16 additional shell entities, financial flows through 4 countries. He paused. They're going to need people who understand how the operational side of these structures works, people who can look at a surveillance package and understand what they're actually looking at. She said, that's not what you came up here to tell me. He said no. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the valley. I found something in the network map that wasn't in the Meridian file, a separate contract vehicle, different authorization structure, different routing, but the fingerprint is identical, same method of document suppression, same pattern for removing people from positions where they could see what was happening. He let that sit for a moment. There are 31 confirmed names on the network map. They project it reaches 45 when the full analysis is done. She looked at the valley. She said, how many of those structures have a Dennis Harwick in them? Someone inside who tried to stop it. He said probably most of them. That's how they survive, not because nobody inside objects, because the objections get buried fast enough and cleanly enough that the next person who might object doesn't know anyone already tried. She sat with that. She thought about a 40-year-old man at a border crossing in 2007 who had seen something and decided to say something about it, and who had died in a compound with his family because the structure above him was built to ensure that saying something led to exactly that. She thought about how many compounds there had been, how many border crossings, how many people who had decided to say something, and how many structures built specifically to make that decision fatal. She thought about what it would mean to find one Dennis Harwick in each of those structures, one person who knew, one person whose knowledge had been buried, one person whose 11 years of careful work was sitting in a lead pouch inside a boot inside a locked footlocker, waiting for someone to come and carry it forward. She thought about her father's voice saying hatchling. She thought he knew what he was building. She thought he built it for exactly this. She took the photograph out of her jacket pocket one more time, looked at it. The dress blues, the expression that would not lie, the inscription she had. Spent 15 years misreading. She put it back. She stood up. Garrett stood up a moment after her, without asking why. She said, "The rifle." He said, "What about it?" She said, "I put it in the van this morning, before I came up here." He looked at her. She said, "Not wrapped, just on the seat." He understood. She could see that he understood, that he knew the difference between a rifle on a seat and a rifle in oilcloth under a floorboard, and that the difference was not about the rifle. It was about the woman who had placed it there, and what placing it there meant about what she had decided. Not hidden, not stored, not ceremonial, available. He said, "I'll drive." She said, "I know." She took one last look at the valley, the snow coming down in its unhurried way, covering the granite, softening the tree line, filling the tracks they had made coming up the ridge, until the ridge looked as it had before they arrived. She turned and walked down. The snow kept falling behind her, covering the ridge, covering the rock, covering everything back to the clean surface it had been before this day. Before this 3 weeks, before the night a truck pulled up at 2:11, and a man stood in the snow with something that weighed more than the case that held it. The van was at the trailhead. The rifle was on the seat. Not wrapped. She got in.